In this clip, Camille Gregor compares Jesus and Romulus. Are they comparable? Is there good reason when reading the Gospels to consider that maybe these authors are aware of Romulus, the stories that have been told throughout the Roman Empire about Rome's figurehead, Rome's founder? Maybe. And let's compare it to Jesus. This comes from an interview where we were responding back to Christian apologist Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy and David Wood. Oftentimes we find that apologetics wants to kind of divorce Jesus from other figures and act like he is unique and special and there is no comparison to anyone else. Not only do we find there is comparison, but while he is unique and special in his own way, so is every other figure, God, demigod, men who become gods once they die and ascend, you name it. Everybody's unique and has a different story to tell, but we're trying to flatten the field or even the playing field. I hope you enjoy this clip. Don't forget, like the video, comment, let us know what you think about it. Check out the Patreon for many more videos and to help support us with our work.
We have a missing body. Romulus doesn't die, or at least, that there are, as with actually the Gospels, there are several different versions of the story floating around. So just like there are people who think that, the disciples just stole the body, there are also people who think that Romulus was murdered by a conspiracy of the Senate. And that's how he disappeared. Like, his body disappeared because after he was murdered, the senators chopped his body up and hid the pieces. And that's why he's nowhere to be seen. But in the alternative version, which is what supposedly happened in the mythology, he is ascended. So he just disappears from Earth, right? We have a disembodied. We have prodigies. So his translation is actually foretold in advance. That is a motif of darkness over the land. He gives a speech on a mountaintop. He gives a great commission specifically to Proclus. So he appears later to a Roman noble. He reveals his identity. He tells him who he is. He tells him that he has a new divine name. And then he gives Romans commission. He tells them what they are supposed to do, what their ethical imperatives are. Of course, being Romans, it has to do with conquering the world, right? But that's explainable by these cultural differences. He ascends to heaven. He's a son of a god, in this case, Mars. The meeting is on a road, which is parallels. There is an argument that the appearance to Proclus parallels specifically the appearance to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. There's eyewitness testimony, so Proclus actually testifies before the Roman Senate that this is what happened, and that's like a legal basis for the Senate decreeing, recognizing essentially Romulus as a deity and officiating his worship, temples being built in his name, rituals being performed, festivals and stuff like that. He's taken away in a cloud. This is something that I've talked about last time. People in the ancient world had a particular way to depict disappearance. So they didn't do it the way how we do it in movies, where you just like fade away. When someone disappears in the ancient world, they disappear into a cloud. So they are obstructed from vision. They just don't like disappear like the transporter beam in Star Trek. So again, is it just a coincidence that in the one text that describes specifically Jesus ascending to heaven, we have this motif also, given that this is how people did it back then? I don't think so. There are dubious alternative accounts. So again, and this is, by the way, a very, very frequent element, right? I have hundreds and hundreds of examples now, hundreds and hundreds of specific passages that have to do with this divine translation. And there are two elements that are extremely common. As soon as someone mentions that someone was translated into a divine being, they say two things. First of all, they say that the person is being worshipped. and they usually go on to describe the worship. So they say, oh, they have a temple here, or this festival is being performed in their name. They are being honored by these sacrifices and stuff like that. It's almost always tied very closely together, usually in the same like paragraph or in the same passage. And the second element that's almost always there is there are actually multiple different accounts. One of them has the divine translation, but the other one explains it, you could say, naturalistically, right? So, in one account, the person is translated and becomes a divine being, but then there are alternatives that are consistent with them not actually being divine beings. And there are reasons for that. It has to do with how people had a tendency in the ancient world to rationalize myths and to kind of bring them more in line with everyday human experience. Euhemerization of mythology is, for example, along the same lines. We have an immortal heavenly body. It's outside a city, okay. People flee. So there was a specific festival that commemorated ascension of Romulus called Populi Fugia, where actually the whole thing was apparently ritualistically performed. And there are several sources that say that. And one of the things that was performed was this flight of the people. You can imagine it like celebrating Easter, for example, in here in Central and Eastern Europe. We have Passion Plays. You probably have that as well in the US, right? Mm-hmm. Where you kind of recreate the scenery. But of course, in this case, the flight of the people would parallel the disciples' scattering. You have deification, of course. By the way, Romulus pre-existed because he wasn't just a human being who became a god after he died. Romans believe in pre-existence. They believed that these people who were deified were already divine before they were born. It's just for a brief period of time, for one human lifespan, they were born to mortal women, and they lived on earth as human beings. And after they died, they returned to the divine realm. It's actually interesting, you can see it very clearly in Latin, because unlike Greek, when Latin writers write about this, they use verbs that have an element of repetition. So they say, he returned, right? It doesn't say he went to heaven. No, he returned to heaven, because he was already there before he was born.
Oh, wow.
Belief, homage, and rejoicing. So there is like an element of some cognitive resistance. So people don't buy it. People are confused. They don't know what's happening. And then there is recognition, and then there is rejoicing. Bright and shining appearance. That's also interesting. Again, Romulus, when he appears in full body armor. Jesus doesn't do that, even though there are depictions of Jesus as a warrior, of course. But again, it's explainable. Like, it's a different matrix of religious symbology that has to do with how the deity is different, how it performs in its religious framework, right? So these are. We have more. People are frightened, or Proculus is frightened, or both. All in sorrow over loss, so people are grieving before they realize what happens. Inspired message of apotheosis. I don't actually know what this is supposed to be. What is missing here, and I don't know why, is divine name. This is something that I also mentioned the last time. Jesus receives a divine name that he apparently didn't have before when he's exalted. The divine name is Kyrios, the Lord. We have it in Philippians 2. And Romulus also receives a divine name, Quirinius. And what's interesting is that in both cases, the reason why this divine name is received is the same. Both Jesus and Romulus have this divine name because they need to be merged or syncretized with previous deities. So they're probably, we don't know because sources on Roman religion are relatively scarce, especially early on, but there probably was an already existing Roman deity named Quirinus. And when the Romans started worshipping Romulus as a god, they just merged the two And the way how this was depicted in mythology is that Romulus received this divine name. So he became again the god Quirinus. And the reason why Jesus receives the divine name Kyrios in Philippians 2 is to solve the question of how is it the case that Jesus can atone for sins if in the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, it says repeatedly that the only salvific agent, the only person who can atone for sins is Kyrios, the Lord. Of course, the solution is right there in Philippians. Jesus receives the name Kyrios when he's exalted. So he now has the authority or the prerogative to forgive sins. And all of the passages in the Hebrew Bible that talk about the Kyrios being the only agent who can forgive sins now apply to Jesus, so that's fine. And Paul pretty much says this explicitly in Romans as well. So that's another parallel that's missing. A lot of this, I think, is pretty weak sauce. So I wouldn't posit like a genetic link between Jesus and Romulus. But if someone made me bet like a large amount of money on whether there is a specific deity that at least the Gospel of Luke is being modeled on. Like, so if someone told me there really is a genetic link with one of these examples and you are going to win a prize if you guess correctly, then I would probably guess Romulus. But I think,
Yeah.
not sure. Like, I wouldn't argue for a genetic link necessarily, but it's really interesting.
That is,
and you have to also. It's important to frame it specifically in the context of the first century, right? Because what was happening in the first century is the beginning of the Roman Principate. So Romans have just finished the conquest of the Mediterranean world, and they were ruling pretty much the entire known world from the perspective of people in Judea with an iron fist. And there was a sustained imperial propaganda of imperial deification. So this ruler of the world was being depicted. There was like a systematic cultural attempt to depict him and people around him, his predecessors and his like subsequent emperors as divine beings. This is something that early Christians knew about, and this is something that the gospel authors knew about. Like when Jesus is handed the denarius and he says, to Caesar, that belongs to Caesar, and to God what belongs to God. The denarius literally had an inscription saying, a son of God. It would be a denarius of Caesar Tiberius, and on denarii that were minted with Tiberius, it literally says, Deus Filii. Filius Dei, a son of God, son of a god, because his predecessor Caesar Augustus was a god.
right.
So you have to imagine, like you have to keep in mind, this is something that, for example, John Dominic Crossan talks about, that this is the culture in which the people lived in. And it's not really implausible to believe that someone in the position of the gospel writers would try to push back against this, and they would try to create like a countercultural figure around Jesus. And this is something that, for example, Richard Miller also goes on, like the framework of his book, Resurrection and Reception in Early Christianity, is colonial and post-colonial theory. It's a framework for analyzing how in environment of colonialism, there is a cultural interaction between the colonizing culture and the culture of the people that are being colonized, and how sometimes the people who are being colonized try to subvert the culture of the colonizers. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways how you could subvert it, if you are being ruled by the Roman Empire, is like intentionally depicting the hero that you identify with as sharing similarities with the deified emperor, but also depicting him differently, better, contrasting him, depicting him as more Jewish, and these kinds of things.